The journal hit the floor of the saloon with a sound like a gunshot. Every head turned. Every conversation died. The piano player's fingers froze above the keys, and the only sound left in the Red Mesa saloon was the low moan of October wind pushing through the gaps in the wooden walls, and the hard, ragged breathing of a woman standing over a man who sat at the corner table with his hat pulled low, and his hands flat against the scarred wood like he was trying to hold the earth in place beneath him. 2 years, she said. Her voice was not loud. That made it worse. 2 years you have been writing my name in that book. Preston Rourke did not move. He did not look up. The leather journal lay splayed open on the floor between them, its pages yellowed at the edges from too many nights beside a kerosene lamp, from too many mornings when the cattle were still sleeping, and the sky was the color of a bruise, and he had nothing but a stub of pencil and the ghost of a name he had heard only once, spoken by a dying man on the road to Tucson. Willa Zane's boots were dusty from the trail. She had ridden 40 miles to find this town. She had ridden 40 miles because her cousin had sent her a letter that said, very simply, "The man at the Rourke Cattle Company in Red Mesa knows something about your father. He has been asking about you. Be careful." She had not been careful. She had walked straight into the saloon, and she had heard a man at the bar say Rourke and nod at the corner, and she had crossed the room and seen the journal lying open beside his whiskey glass, and she had seen her own name written there in a cramped, deliberate hand. Not once. Not as a note or a reminder, her name, written over and over across pages and pages in the same handwriting day after day. Willa Zane. Willa Zane. Willa Zane, and beside it sometimes small entries, descriptions, questions, prayers. "Look at me," she said. He looked up. He was not what she had expected. She had expected something threatening, someone calculating, someone with cold eyes and an agenda carved into his features. What she saw instead was a man who looked like he had been caught doing something he was deeply ashamed of, and also deeply helpless to stop. He was perhaps 30 years old, with the kind of face that wind and sun had made honest rather than hard. Dark brown eyes. A jaw that held its tension the way stone holds heat long after the sun has gone. A scar along his left cheekbone, pale as old snow. And his expression when he looked at her was not the expression of a predator. It was the expression of a man who had just seen a ghost walk into the room and say his name. "You are her," he said. His voice was barely above a whisper. "You are actually her." To understand what happened in that saloon on the 3rd of October, 1882, you have to go back to the road outside Tucson in the autumn of 1880. And you have to understand what kind of man Preston Rourke was before a stranger died in the dust beside his horse and changed the entire direction of his life. Preston had come to Arizona Territory from Kansas at the age of 26, driving a small herd of cattle he had spent 4 years saving to buy. He was not a romantic man, or rather, he had taught himself not to be. His mother had died when he was 11. His father had followed 2 years later, leaving Preston and his younger brother Thomas to work for whatever rancher would take them on. Thomas had gone east at 17, found work in a printing office, sent letters at Christmas that grew shorter and then stopped entirely. Preston had stayed west because west was the only direction that had ever made sense to him. West was open. West was where the land did not crowd in on a man and demand that he be something he was not ready to be. He had built the Rourke Cattle Company from almost nothing. A parcel of dry land outside Red Mesa. A modest house with a stone foundation and a leaking roof. A bunkhouse where 3 cowboys slept and complained about the heat. A water tank that needed constant maintenance. And roughly 200 head of cattle that Preston knew individually, the way a father knows his children. He was not unhappy exactly. But he was alone in a way that had become so familiar he had stopped noticing it. The way you stop noticing the ache in an old injury until the weather changes, and suddenly you cannot think of anything else. He was alone, and he had been alone for a long time, and he had made a kind of peace with it. The road to Tucson changed that. He was riding to Tucson to settle a dispute over a land registry error, a dull piece of business that he expected to take 2 days and give him a headache. It was late afternoon, and the desert was cooling into something almost bearable, and his horse anchor was walking at an easy pace through the Ocotillo and Mesquite when he heard the sound. At first, he thought it was a coyote. Then he reined in anchor and listened harder, and he understood it was a man. The man was lying off the side of the road, half in a dry wash, his horse gone, his water gone, his coat dark with old blood from a wound in his side that had clearly been poorly tended for several days. He was delirious with fever and his lips were cracked, and he was somewhere between dying and already gone. Preston did what any decent man would have done. He got down off his horse. He gave the man water carefully, in small amounts, because a man that dehydrated could drown himself with too much too fast. He cut away the ruined cloth around the wound and cleaned it with the whiskey he carried for exactly this kind of emergency. He made a fire and tried to keep the man warm as the desert night came down cold and absolute around them. The man's name was George Zane. He was 52 years old, and he was a surveyor from New Mexico Territory, and he had been on his way to Tucson to file papers on a parcel of land he had been granted for 20 years of government survey work. He had been set upon by 2 men 3 days back, robbed of his horse and his money and most of his supplies, and the wound in his side was worse than it looked from the outside. Preston knew it by midnight. The man was not going to survive to see the Tucson courthouse. Whatever needed doing for George Zane would have to be done on the side of that road, in the dark, with Preston Rourke as the only witness. George Zane was a practical man, even dying. He did not waste time on lament. He asked Preston his name, and when Preston told him, George nodded as though approving of it. Then he told Preston about the land in New Mexico. A small valley, well watered by a creek that had never gone dry in all the years he had surveyed it. A beautiful piece of country, he said. He had always meant to build on it. He never had. He had spent his life moving from one survey camp to the next, and the land had waited for him, and now it would go on waiting. My daughter, he said, around 2 in the morning when the fever was pulling him in and out. My daughter should have it. The land, everything. I have a will in my kit, but the kit is gone with the horse. I have a daughter, mister. Her name is Willa Zane. She lives with her cousin in Las Cruces. Preston wrote down everything the man said. He had a small notebook in his coat pocket, an ordinary thing he had bought at the general store in Red Mesa, and used mostly for tallying cattle numbers and noting fence repairs. He wrote down the name of the land, the claim number that George Zane managed to recite through gritted teeth, the cousin's address in Las Cruces, and the name, Willa Zane. He wrote it down because a dying man asked him to. He wrote it down so he would not forget. He wrote it down so that when George Zane was gone and the sun came up and Preston rode on to Tucson, he could do what needed doing for a stranger who had no one else in that desert to do it for him. George Zane died just before dawn. He died quietly, which seemed like a mercy. Preston sat with him until the light came, and then he buried him as decently as he could manage, and he marked the grave with stones so it could be found again, and he rode on to Tucson. In Tucson, he filed the report about the assault and the theft with the sheriff's office, not that he expected much to come of it. He found a land office and asked about the Zane claim, and was told that without documentation and without a claimant present, The process was complicated. He hired a lawyer, a small, efficient man named Davis, who charged reasonable rates and seemed genuinely interested in doing right by a dead man's wishes. He left the details with Davis and rode back to Red Mesa. He meant to write to Willa Zane immediately. He sat down at the table in his house that very evening, with the lamp lit and paper in front of him, and he could not figure out how to begin. How do you write to a woman you have never met to tell her that her father is dead? How do you explain that you buried him on the side of a road in Arizona, and that you are trying to secure her inheritance through legal channels, and that you are a stranger with no particular claim on her attention or her trust? He wrote 3 drafts. He tore them all up. He told himself he would write tomorrow when he had found the right words. Tomorrow became the next day, and the next day became a week, and the week became a month, and then 2 months, and somewhere in the middle of all that, something shifted in him that he could not precisely name or explain. He had written her name in his notebook every day since George Zane died. At first it was simply to remind himself of the task he had not completed. Then it became something else. He began writing small notes beside the name, questions he wanted to ask her, things he imagined about her based on nothing more than the dying words of a father who had spoken of her with such plainness and such love. He imagined she was brave because her father had been brave. He imagined she was practical because her father had been practical. He imagined her in the high desert country near Las Cruces, going about her days without knowing that somewhere in Arizona territory, a man she had never met was carrying the story of her father's last hours and had not yet found the courage to deliver it to her. When the small notebook was full, he bought a proper journal from the general store, a leather-bound one with heavy pages, and he transferred everything he had written and kept going. He understood, at some point during the winter of 1881, that this had crossed a line from obligation into something more complicated. A man did not write a stranger's name every day for months unless the name had gotten under his skin. But the name was all he had. Willa Zane was not a real person to him yet. She was a shape, a silhouette cast by a dying man's love. She was the valley in New Mexico that her father had never built on. She was the life that George Zane had meant to give her and run out of time to arrange. He wrote to the lawyer Davis 3 more times about the land claim. The process was slow, as everything involving territorial government was slow, but Davis was persistent, and eventually, in the spring of 1882, the Zane claim was confirmed and officially registered in the name of Willa Zane of Las Cruces, New Mexico territory. Davis sent the papers to the Las Cruces address George Zane had given Preston in those last hours. Preston waited. He expected to hear from her. He expected a letter that would allow him to explain, finally, who he was and what he had done and why it had taken so long. He heard nothing. He kept writing her name. He kept writing it the way a man keeps a small, private light burning in a window, without quite being able to say who he thinks might see it. By the summer of 1882, his own awareness of what he was doing had become uncomfortable. He was not a man who normally examined his own interior life with any great interest, but even he could see that what had begun as obligation and conscience had become something more personal, more searching, more honest. He wrote her name, and beside it he wrote things like, "I wonder if she is well. I wonder if Davis's letter reached her. I wonder if she knows her father loved her enough to say her name with his last breath." He wrote things like, "I think I should have written sooner. I think I made a mistake by waiting, and now it is too late to explain the waiting without it seeming wrong." He wrote, once, in a moment of unusual candor that he immediately felt embarrassed by, "I think I have made her into something in my head that she will never be able to be in real life, and I think I have done this because I am lonely, and because she is the only story I have held onto long enough to become attached to." He reread that entry the next morning and closed the journal very firmly, and went out to work with his cattle and did not open it again for 3 days. When he opened it again, he wrote her name. What Preston did not know, through all of this, was that Davis's letter had reached Las Cruces, but had not reached Willa Zane directly. It had reached her cousin Marcus Zane, who had held on to it for reasons that were not entirely clear, and who had eventually, in September of 1882, mentioned to Willa in a letter that she might have some business to look into in Red Mesa, Arizona. Not the whole story, just the edge of it. Just enough to make her get on her horse and ride. Marcus had added a line that worried Willa considerably. He had said that the man at the Rourke Cattle Company had been asking about her, and she should be careful. Willa Zane was 26 years old in the autumn of 1882. She had been living in Las Cruces for 4 years, since she had left her teaching position in Santa Fe after a difficult and painful situation that she did not often speak about. In Las Cruces, she had found work as a seamstress, and then as a bookkeeper for a dry goods merchant named Halstead, and she had built a life for herself that was quiet and self-contained and entirely her own. She had no particular desire for complication. She was also, though she would have been reluctant to frame it in those terms, deeply lonely in a way that practical competence does not resolve. She missed her father, who had been the one person in her life who always made her feel that she was seen clearly and valued truly. His disappearance, 2 years ago, a journey to Tucson from which he had never returned, had left a wound in her that had not healed because it had no shape. He was simply gone. No explanation, no word. She had written to the sheriff's office in Tucson and received a vague response about no information available. She had written twice more and received nothing. So when Marcus said there was a man in Red Mesa who might know something about her father, she saddled her horse the next morning. She was not afraid, exactly. She had learned early in life that fear was a thing you could work with rather than run from, the way you work with a stubborn horse rather than simply refusing to ride. She packed her rifle, her money, her documents, and 3 days of food, and she rode into Arizona territory with her jaw set and her heart pounding. She found Red Mesa on the second day. It was a small town, not much to look at. A main street with a livery stable and a general store and a bank and a saloon and a land office and perhaps 30 buildings in total if you counted generously. She asked at the livery stable about the Rourke Cattle Company and was told it was about 6 miles south of town, but that Preston Rourke generally came in on Mondays to do his banking and take a meal at the saloon. It was Monday. She found him in the saloon, and she found the journal, and she said, 2 years. 2 years you have been writing my name in that book." Now he looked at her across the table in the Red Mesa saloon, and the journal lay on the floor between them, and every person in the building was watching them. And Preston Rourke felt as though the floor had opened up, and he was simply falling through it with no particular expectation of landing. "Please," he said, "please sit down and let me explain. You have been writing my name in a journal for 2 years, and you did not think to write me a letter." "I wrote 3 letters. I could not." He stopped. He tried again. "I could not find the right way to say what I needed to say. I kept putting it off and then putting it off again, and I know how that sounds, but please, please sit down. Your father—" Something crossed her face then, something sharp and terrible and soft all at once. She sat down. Not because she trusted him, but because he had said those 2 words and they had taken the strength out of her legs. The barman quietly sent everyone else's attention back to their own business. The piano player began playing again, softly, something that was not quite sad and not quite cheerful. Preston reached down and picked up the journal from the floor and held it in his hands for a moment, and then he set it on the table between them and looked at her. "Your father was George Zane," he said. "A surveyor. He was on his way to Tucson in the fall of 1880. He was robbed on the road 3 days east of here. By the time I found him, the wound was too far along. I did everything I could. He died before morning." Willa's hands were flat on the table. Her face was very still. "He is buried about 40 miles east of here. I marked the grave with stones and I have the location written down. You can find him if you want to find him." Preston paused. "He talked about you at the end. He said your name. He wanted you to have the land in New Mexico, the claim he had been granted, and I worked with a lawyer named Davis in Tucson to get the claim registered in your name. The papers were sent to your cousin in Las Cruces. Marcus never gave me those papers," she said. The flat, controlled way she said it told Preston a great deal about the cousin named Marcus. "I am sorry. I should have written directly to you. I should have found a way to reach you myself instead of going through the lawyer. That was my mistake." He looked at his hands. "I should have written to you a long time ago. I know that." "Then why," she said slowly, "is my name written across those pages like that? Why is my name in there 100 times, 200 times? That is not a lawyer's record. That is not a man keeping notes on a legal matter." The question was exactly fair. Preston had known it was coming from the moment she sat down. He had known it was coming, actually, for about a year. He had imagined having this conversation 100 times in the pages of that very journal. "Because," he said, "I did not know how to let go of it. I did not know how to let go of your father's last hours. He loved you. He said your name the way people say the name of the thing they are most afraid to leave behind. And I had failed to do right by you, failed to write when I should have written, and so you stayed in my head as the person I owed a debt to. And then," he stopped again. "And then," she said. "And then it was more than that," he said. "And I know how it looks, I know how strange it is. But it is the truth, and you deserve the truth, since I have already failed you enough by keeping it this long." She looked at him for a long time. The saloon hummed quietly around them. She looked at the journal and then back at him, and then down at the table. "My father's name was George Zane," she said. It was not a question. She was saying it out loud to make it real, to make the 2 years of not knowing have an answer finally, even if the answer was the worst one. "Yes," he said, "and he died knowing that I would be taken care of." "He died knowing that I would try to make sure of it," Preston said. "I cannot speak to whether I succeeded. That depends a great deal on a cousin who apparently held onto papers that were not his to hold." Something moved across Willa's face then. It might have been grief, or the edge of anger, or both. She took a slow breath and let it out and put both hands around the coffee cup the barman had quietly set in front of her without being asked. "I want to see the grave," she said. "I will take you, tomorrow if you want." She looked at him again. "Why? Why would you take a day away from your work to take a woman you don't know 40 miles into the desert?" "Because I owe you more than I have given you," he said. "And because I would like to be someone who does right by George Zane's daughter, even if I have been very late in getting around to it." She was silent for a long time. Then she said, "You have a bed in that bunkhouse for the night. I can have one of my hands sleep in the house. The bunkhouse is better than the hotel here." "All right," she said. She picked up the coffee cup. "I will eat something and then you can show me to the Rourke Cattle Company, Preston Rourke, and tomorrow you can take me to my father's grave, and after that we will see." "After that we will see," he agreed. And something in him, some long-held tightness, moved very slightly towards something that was not quite ease but was in the neighborhood of it. They rode out to the ranch in the late afternoon. Willa rode her own horse, a sturdy gray mare she called Patience, which Preston thought was either a virtue or a warning. The land around Red Mesa was the high desert kind, not the flat, empty kind, but the dramatic kind. All red rock formations and wide sky and stands of juniper that smelled like something between earth and rain. He watched her take it in as they rode, not with the wonder of someone seeing desert for the first time, but with the attentive, professional appreciation of someone who has spent time with surveying equipment and knows how to read land. "Your father taught you to look at land that way," he said. It was not really a question. She glanced at him. "He took me on survey trips every summer until I was 16. I know how to use a compass and how to read a contour line and how to tell good water from bad by the plant life around it. That is useful knowledge out here." "It is useful knowledge anywhere," she said. "People underestimate what a woman knows about practical things, and I have mostly stopped trying to correct them." Preston filed that away. "I won't underestimate you," he said, and he meant it without performance, which she seemed to register because she looked at him again with slightly different eyes. The ranch was not grand, but it was solid. The stone foundation of the main house was the first thing you noticed because it was unusual. Most buildings out here were wood frame, and stone said something about a man's intention to stay. There was a kitchen garden to the south side that was more productive than it had any right to be in that climate, testament to whoever had nursed it along with care. 2 dogs came out to meet them at the gate, a large tan one and a smaller spotted one, both well-fed and calm. Willa swung down off Patience and let the dogs smell her hand. "What are their names?" "The big one is Ledger. The small one is Ink." She looked up at him with something close to amusement. "You named your dogs after things you use for riding." "I did not plan it that way," he said, though he had a feeling that was not entirely true. His 3 ranch hands, brothers all, were named Victor, Sam, and Elias Ford. They were polite and notably incurious about the presence of a woman at the Rourke Ranch, which either meant Preston had told them very little or that they were trained by experience to ask no unnecessary questions. Probably both. Victor moved his gear to the main house without complaint, and Willa was given the cleanest corner of the bunkhouse with a curtain that Elias had produced from somewhere, with what seemed like pre-prepared efficiency. She came out to find Preston sitting on the porch steps after supper, the journal closed in his lap, looking at the night sky with the expression of a man who is conducting a conversation with himself that he does not expect to win. She sat down on the step below him without asking. The night out here was vast and full. The Milky Way stretched across the sky with a confidence it never had in town, and the air smelled of juniper and cooling stone. "How did you know he was dying and not just badly hurt?" she asked. Not accusingly, genuinely. "The color of the wound," he said. And the fever had gone too high and come down again to that flat, still kind that is worse than the high kind, and something in his eyes. You can usually tell. She was quiet for a moment. "He hated being still," she said. "He never could have stood being ill and dependent on someone." At least, she stopped. "At least it was fast," Preston said. "He did not suffer for long, and he was not afraid." "No," she said, "he would not have been." She pulled her coat more tightly around herself. "He would have been angry, that is what he would have been. Furious that there was more to do and he was not going to get to do it." "He was a little angry," Preston said carefully, "but mostly he was thinking about the practical things. The claim, making sure you would have it. He always thought about the practical things." There was grief in her voice and love in it, and something that was not quite resentment, but was the complicated thing that lives near resentment when someone who loved you was better at being a father from a distance than up close. "Tell me what he said. Exactly, if you can remember." Preston could remember. He had written it down. He opened the journal to the earliest pages and read to her in the dark, by the thin light that came from the window behind them, the words George Zane had said with his last hours of clarity. The land in New Mexico. The claim number. The cousin's address. And her name, said the way Preston had written it, like something precious that had to be placed carefully into someone else's hands. When he finished reading, Willa was very still. "You wrote all of that the night he died," she said. "Yes." "And then you kept writing my name every day after." "Yes." She turned to look at him over her shoulder. In the lamplight coming from the window, she was very real and very much herself, not the silhouette he had been carrying for 2 years. She had a face that was made for the outdoors, not delicately but honestly, a face that had weather in it and thought in it and something that kept its own counsel while still being entirely present. Her eyes, which had been dark with suspicion in the saloon, were now simply dark, thoughtful, searching. "That must have been very lonely," she said, "carrying all of that for 2 years with no one to put it down for." He had not expected her to say that. He had expected judgment, or at minimum continued suspicion. The directness of her sympathy caught him so completely unprepared that he felt something happen in his chest that he was not going to name just yet. "It was lonely," he said. "Yes. I know something about that kind of lonely," she said. She turned back to look at the sky. "I spent 2 years not knowing where my father was or whether he was alive. That is a different kind of carrying, but it is heavy in a similar way." "I am sorry," he said. "I am sorry I made it longer than it had to be." She was quiet for a moment. "You did not make him die on that road. And you did what you could with what you had. You were a stranger and you buried him properly and you worked to get me my inheritance. Those are not small things." She paused. "The writing of my name every day is strange, but I understand the impulse. When you are trying to hold onto something that matters, you do what you can with the tools you have." They sat in silence for a while after that. It was not an uncomfortable silence. It was the kind that forms between two people who have said something true to each other and are letting it settle. "Tell me about this ranch," she said eventually, because she was a practical woman and grief needed to be leavened with the present tense. He told her. He told her about the cattle, the land, the water situation. The year 2 winters ago when a bad ice storm had killed 30 head, and he had been close to losing the whole enterprise. And the decision he had made to diversify into a small herd of horses, because the army was buying horses and paying better rates than the beef market justified. He told her about Red Mesa itself, the politics of it, the banker named Holt who was not entirely trustworthy, the sheriff named Braddock who was methodical and slow but ultimately fair. He told her about the Ford brothers, who had been with him 3 years and were as close to family as he had. She listened the way she had looked at the landscape riding in, with complete and attentive focus, as though she was reading something that would be important later. By the time they said good night, something had shifted between them. It was not yet anything he could name with certainty. It was the first movement of a thing, the way water first moves when the grade of a hillside begins to change. But it was something. He was sure of that. They rode out at first light the next morning. Victor came with them, because Preston was not a fool about the desert, and having a third rider made practical sense. They rode east in the early cool, and Preston navigated by landmarks he had memorized so thoroughly over 2 years of thinking about this exact journey that he could have found the spot in his sleep. They found the grave just before noon. The stones were still there. He had used substantial ones, the kind that did not move easily, and arranged them in a shape that was clearly intentional, clearly a marker. The desert had settled around them without disturbing them. A Palo Verde tree grew close enough to cast shade in the afternoon. Willa stood at the edge of the grave for a long time. Preston and Victor stood back with the horses and said nothing, because nothing was required from them. She knelt eventually and touched the stones one by one, the way you trace the features of something you are trying to memorize. And she said something very quietly that was meant only for the person under those stones and no one else. When she stood up, she had the look of someone who has finished a conversation that needed finishing. Not done with grief, not healed, but complete in a specific, necessary way. "Thank you," she said to Preston, and she meant several things at once. They camped that night on the way back, because 40 miles in one day was pushing the horses, and the three of them made a fire and ate from the provisions Victor had packed with characteristic efficiency. Victor was a man of very few words who expressed his character entirely through action, and his action this trip had been consistently good. After supper, he drifted to the edge of the firelight and fell asleep with the absolute immediate facility of a man accustomed to sleeping rough. Preston and Willa stayed by the fire. "Tell me about the land in New Mexico," she said. "The land my father wanted me to have. I have not seen it. I only know what he told me. A valley," he said, "well watered by a creek that never went dry, good grass." "He took me near there once," she said. "When I was 12. I remember the creek. It was cold and clear even in August. The valley was green when everything else around it was dry." She stared into the fire. "He never built anything there because he was always between one survey and the next. He kept saying there would be time later." "There is time now," Preston said carefully. "The land is yours." She looked at him. "I am a bookkeeper in Las Cruces. I do not know how to run a ranch." "You know how to read land," he said. She smiled at that briefly, and it was the first real smile he had seen from her. Not the careful, guarded kind she had been managing since the saloon, but the real kind, the kind that came from some place that had not been on guard. It was a remarkable thing, that smile, and he felt it somewhere behind his ribs. "That is different from knowing how to run one," she said. "Everything useful is learnable," he said. "You strike me as someone who has learned a great deal of useful things." She looked at him steadily for a moment. "You have imagined a great deal about me," she said. "Over 2 years of writing my name and making notes, am I what you imagined?" It was such a direct question that it deserved a direct answer. "No," he said. "You are better. What I imagined was a shape of a person. You are an actual person." "That is always better." She was quiet for a moment, looking at the fire. "I imagined you were threatening," she said. "My cousin's letter made it sound suspicious, a man writing about me and asking questions." Was he wrong to think that? She considered. He was not wrong to be cautious. But he was wrong about the character of it. She paused. "I think my cousin kept those papers from me deliberately, to keep me dependent on him. I think Davis's letter would have given me enough independence to leave Las Cruces, and Marcus preferred that I stayed." Preston felt a cold, controlled anger on her behalf. "That is a serious thing." "It is," she said, without melodrama. "But it is also not surprising. Men have been making decisions about my circumstances without my knowledge for most of my adult life. At least you made a decision that helped me rather than hindered me, even if it took 2 years. I will not make decisions about your circumstances without your knowledge going forward," he said. "You have my word." She looked at him again in the firelight. "That is a strange thing to promise to someone you met yesterday." "It may be," he said. "But I have been talking to you in that journal for 2 years. You do not feel like someone I met yesterday." She was quiet for a long time after that. He waited, because she was someone who needed time with words before she answered them, which was not a flaw but a quality. "I do not feel that way either," she said finally, "which is uncomfortable. Because it means I am in the position of having feelings for someone based on circumstances that are not exactly ordinary, and I do not know yet how much of it is real and how much of it is just the circumstances making something feel more significant than it is. That is honest, he said. I try to be honest, she said. It has gotten me into trouble at various points, but I would rather have the trouble than the alternative. What happened in Santa Fe? He asked, because she had mentioned it as a difficult situation in the way people mention things they want to put down but have not yet worked out how to. She was quiet long enough that he thought she might not answer. I was teaching at a school, she said. I had a colleague, a man. He was charming and attentive, and I made the mistake of believing that the attention meant what I thought it meant. It did not. When I declined to continue what had been a courtship on his terms, he made my position at the school untenable through a sustained campaign of small cruelties and professional undermining. I left because staying was costing me things I could not afford to lose. She paused. I left also because I was angry enough that I was afraid of what I might do if I stayed. Preston sat with that. You did the right thing, he said. Leaving? I know, she said, but right things are not always comfortable to live with. No, he said, they are not. They sat in companionable quiet for a while, the fire burning down to steady orange coals, the desert night enormous and full around them. I need to go back to Las Cruces, she said. I have work. I have a life there of a kind. I need to sort out what Marcus knew and what he did, and I need to get those papers. I know, he said. I am not asking you to stay, she glanced at him. But I would like to write to you, properly this time, directly to you. She looked at the coals. I think, she said slowly, that I would like that, since you have established a certain precedent for writing. He laughed at that. It surprised him how much relief was in the laugh. I will write actual letters, he said, not just your name. That is a much more useful format, she said, and there was a warmth in her voice that had not been there in the saloon. They rode back to the ranch the next morning, and Willa spent another day there, partly because her horse needed the rest and partly, Preston suspected, because she was not yet ready to leave. He showed her around the operation with the same serious attention to detail he brought to everything, and she asked questions that demonstrated she had been paying attention to everything he had said the night before. She understood the water situation immediately and had two suggestions for the tank maintenance that Victor, who knew more about such things than Preston did, nodded at approvingly. She helped Elias in the kitchen garden in the afternoon, not because anyone asked her to, but because she saw something that needed doing and did it. And afterward, she had a long conversation with Sam about the horses, specifically about the gray mare Patience's gait, and whether a small adjustment in her shoeing might help what appeared to be a minor soreness in her left foreleg. Preston watched all of this from various distances and felt something expanding in him that he had not felt in years. It was not the imagined shape of her from the journal. It was her, actual and present and entirely herself, moving through his world with the ease of someone who understood how things worked and was not afraid of work. When she saddled Patience the next morning to leave, he stood at the gate with the two dogs and watched her check the cinch and adjust the saddlebag with economical, practiced hands. I will write, he said. You have shown considerable dedication to the practice, she said. I trust you to keep it up, he smiled. Have a safe ride. She looked at him for a moment from horseback, and he could not quite read what was in her face, except that it was not the wariness of the saloon. It was something more open than that, something that had not yet decided what it was going to be but was not afraid of the question. Preston Rourke, she said. Yes. Thank you for finding my father on that road. Whatever else you did or did not do with the years after it, you found him and you stayed with him and you did not leave him alone. That matters more than the rest of it. She paused. I will write back. She rode south, and he stood at the gate until she was out of sight, and then he went inside and sat down at the table and opened the journal to the first blank page he came to. He did not write her name. He wrote, "She is real. She is better than I imagined. I think I am in very serious trouble." The letters began within the week. His first letter was 3 pages, carefully written, about the ranch and the cattle and the water tank and the conversation he'd had with Victor about her suggestions. He mentioned, with deliberate lightness, that he had looked into the matter of Marcus Zane through Davis the lawyer, and that it appeared Marcus had indeed received the land papers and had not passed them on, a situation which Davis believed constituted a legal violation and which could be addressed if Willa wished to address it. Her response came 12 days later. It was 4 pages. She told him she had confronted Marcus directly, which had gone about as well as expected, meaning poorly, and that she had then gone to the post office and confirmed with the postmaster that a large envelope from a Tucson law office had been delivered to her cousin's address over a year ago. Armed with that information and Marcus's obvious guilt, she had obtained the papers and was now in possession of the full land claim for the valley in New Mexico. She told him that she had given her notice at Halstead's dry goods establishment, not because she had a plan, but because staying there and staying in her cousin's orbit was no longer something she was willing to do. She told him she was thinking about the valley. She told him she had ridden out to look at it, and that it was exactly as her father had described and exactly as she remembered from childhood, and that standing in it had been the most specific happiness she had felt in years. She told him, at the end of the letter, that the teacher in Santa Fe had recently sent a letter through a mutual acquaintance attempting to re-engage her interest, and that she had returned it unopened, and that this action had felt like putting something down that she had been carrying much too long. Preston read that paragraph 4 times. Then he wrote back immediately. The letters accumulated. They wrote about practical things, and they wrote about larger things. They wrote about the land and cattle and water and weather, and they also wrote about loneliness and loss, and what it felt like to build a life from scratch with no particular blueprint, and mostly your own stubbornness to go on. She wrote about her father with a complexity that honored him without pretending he had been uncomplicated. He wrote about his brother Thomas in a way he had not allowed himself before, about the specific grief of a living loss, someone gone not by death, but by distance and silence. By December, the letters had a warmth in them that neither of them was disguising particularly well. By January, Preston had stopped addressing her as Miss Zane in the salutation. By February, she had stopped signing her letters Willa Zane and was signing them simply Willa. In March, she wrote, "I am going to the valley in the spring. I am going to try to build something there. I do not entirely know how, but I know the land and I know how to learn things, and I know that the alternative is continuing a life that fits like a dress made for someone else. I will be about 200 miles from Red Mesa. I wanted you to know." He wrote back within 3 days. He wrote, 200 miles is nothing. I have ridden farther for cattle. I would ride considerably farther than that for a reason that matters more." Her response took longer than usual. He waited with more discomfort than he wanted to admit, but when it came, it was only 1 page, and it was the most direct thing she had ever written to him. She wrote, "I would like you to come see the valley before I start building. I think I would like to show it to you. I think I would like you to see it with your own eyes rather than only knowing it from my father's last words. If that is something you can arrange, I will be there in the 2nd week of May." He arranged it. He left the Rourke Cattle Company in the reliable hands of the Ford brothers for 10 days and rode northwest into New Mexico territory with a fresh horse and a better pair of boots than the ones he usually wore and the journal in his saddlebag. Because some habits do not break just because the circumstances change. He found the valley on the 9th of May, 2 days into New Mexico territory, following her directions with the sort of focused attention he had once reserved entirely for cattle tallies and fence lines. The valley was everything George Zane had said it was. Even in May, when the surrounding country was working hard toward its dry summer, the valley held the green. The creek ran clear and cold down the center of it, lined with cottonwoods that were just coming into their leaf. The grass was deep and good. The land rose on 3 sides into red rock walls that caught and held the heat in winter and provided shade in summer. It was, Preston thought, stopping at the entrance to it on Anchor's Back and looking at it for the first time, the most quietly beautiful place he had ever seen. Willa was standing near the creek. She had heard him coming and turned, and when she saw him, she went still for a moment with something on her face that she did not immediately try to rearrange. He rode down to her and swung off Anchor, and they stood 5 feet apart in the valley that George Zane had meant to give his daughter, and looked at each other the way people look when they have been writing letters for 6 months, and are finally, actually, in the same place again. "You came," she said. "I said I would." "A lot of people say things," she said. "I know," he said. "I am not a lot of people." She looked at him for a moment longer, then she said, "Come see the creek. The water is extraordinary." They spent 3 days in that valley. Preston set up his camp beside hers, and they walked the land in the mornings, and she showed him what she was thinking about where to build, how to orient the house to catch the winter sun and avoid the worst of the summer glare, where a kitchen garden could go, where the land would support cattle if she were to bring cattle in, whether there were other people nearby whose land bordered hers, and what the relationships with neighbors might need to be. She had thought about all of it with the same surveyor's precision her father had applied to other people's land, and which she was now, for the first time, applying to her own. He watched her think and he listened to her talk, and he understood, quite simply and without drama, that whatever had been happening in him since a dying man had said her name on the side of a road had arrived, finally, at a clear destination. He loved this woman. Not the shape of her from the journal, not the idea of her, but this actual person, standing in her father's valley with her hands in her pockets, and her coat pushed back from one shoulder because the afternoon had gone warm, explaining to him in precise detail how she was going to build a life from scratch on this land, because it was hers and she had earned it. On the evening of the 3rd day, they were sitting beside the creek after supper, the way they had sat beside the fire on the desert road 6 months ago, and the cottonwoods were moving in the evening air, and the creek was saying its one ongoing word over the stones, and Preston thought, now, or not at all. "I want to ask you something," he said. She looked at him. She had learned, over the course of 3 days in a camp together, to read his register with some accuracy, and her expression told him she knew this was not a small question. "I want to ask you if you would be willing to consider the possibility of something between us," he said. He was not a man for decorative language in important moments. "I am aware that the way we came to know each other is not ordinary. I am aware that I spent 2 years writing your name in a book before I met you, which is either romantic or alarming depending on how you look at it. And I am aware that you have reasons to be cautious about men who want things from you without your consent. But I want to be clear about what I am asking. I am not asking for anything except your honest consideration of whether what has grown between us in these letters and these past few days is something you want to see where it goes." Willa was quiet for a long time. She looked at the creek. She looked at her hands. She looked at him. "You are going to have to understand something," she said. "I am not a woman who comes with a simple set of circumstances. I have this land and I intend to work it. I have strong opinions about a great many things. I do not do well with men who want me to be quieter or smaller than I am. I have been reading your letters for 6 months, he said. If quiet and small were what I wanted, I had the perfect opportunity to figure that out and change my mind. You are also 40 miles away, she said. 200 at present, he said, but distances change when circumstances do. She looked at the creek again. Then she said, I asked my father once when I was about 14 how you know when something is real versus when it just feels urgent because you are lonely. She paused. He said the difference is whether it still feels true when you are not in the grip of the wanting, whether it holds up when you think about it in the cold light of a regular morning. And does this hold up? Preston asked. In the cold light. I have been thinking about you in the cold light of a great many regular mornings, she said. Since October, a pause. It holds up. He reached across the space between them and took her hand, and she let him, and they sat with the creek and the cottonwoods and the evening, and it was very simple and very complete. They did not rush it. They were both people who had been hurt by things that moved too fast, and they were both people who respected the weight of serious decisions. What came after that evening by the creek was not immediate declaration, but something slower and more assured, the kind of thing that knows its own direction and does not need to announce itself loudly. Preston rode back to Red Mesa after those 3 days, and he wrote her a letter from the road that he sent as soon as he reached the next town with a post office. She wrote back from the valley, where she had stayed to begin the first stage of building, using a local carpenter she had hired from the nearest town, a man she described as extraordinarily competent and nearly entirely silent, which she said made him an ideal colleague. By June she had a structure, not a house yet, but the bones of one. She wrote him detailed updates with rough sketches of the floor plan in the margins. He wrote back with questions that she answered at length. In July he rode out to see it. He stayed 4 days. He helped with the fence line for the kitchen garden, which was honest, straightforward work that he was good at. And he liked working beside her because she had the same relationship to work that he did, quiet and focused, and without the need to fill the silence with noise. One evening, after supper, he kissed her for the first time. It was not sudden. They had been sitting close together on the step of the unfinished house, watching the valley go dark, and he had said her name and she had turned, and it was simply the natural conclusion of a very long conversation. She kissed him back with the same directness she brought to everything else, and afterwards she said quietly, I have been thinking about doing that since the night by the fire on the road. 7 months ago, he said. You could have moved faster, she said. You needed time, he said. So did I, honestly. She leaned against his shoulder. This is a very strange way to fall in love with someone, she said. The name in the journal, he said. 2 years before we met, she said. Yes. She was quiet for a moment. It is either the most peculiar thing I have ever heard of, or the most romantic, and I have gone back and forth on which for about 9 months now. Have you reached a conclusion? I am inclined toward romantic, she said, given the evidence. He held her in the cooling evening, in the valley that her father had meant to give her and had finally managed to, and he thought about George Zane on the side of the road, and the way the right things, sometimes, arrive by terrible roads at the right time anyway. Over the following months, Preston made a decision that he thought through carefully and discussed in full detail with the Ford brothers, who were the closest thing he had to family. The decision was to offer Victor and Sam and Elias an arrangement, a partnership of sorts, a formalized stake in the Rourke Cattle Company in exchange for assuming greater management responsibility. Victor was more than capable of running the ranch's day-to-day operations, and had been doing so informally for 2 years already. Sam had a head for the horse business that surpassed Preston's own. Elias, who was the youngest and the most versatile, would continue in his current role with a meaningful increase in compensation. The three brothers accepted without hesitation. Victor shook Preston's hand in the way that meant more than whatever words might have been said, and Sam made a joke that nobody laughed at except Elias, and then they went back to work. Preston went to see Willa in September with that arrangement finalized, and he asked her father's valet, on a clear afternoon with the cottonwoods beginning to turn, whether she would marry him. He asked her with the directness he had used for everything in their relationship, and she answered with the same. "Yes," she said. "I was beginning to think you were going to spend another 2 years writing it in your journal before you said it out loud." "I considered it," he said. She laughed, and the laugh filled the valley, and he thought he had never heard anything better. They married in November of 1883 in the nearest town to the valley, in a ceremony that was small and practical and deeply sincere. The Ford brothers rode up from Red Mesa. Willa's cousin Marcus was not invited and did not come. There was a minister who was businesslike and warm-hearted in equal measure, and there was a celebration afterward at the town's only restaurant where Victor became unexpectedly festive and demonstrated that he could, in fact, speak at considerable length when he had something he wanted to say, specifically a toast to a man who had the sense to bury his head in a journal for 2 years until he had worked up the nerve to do what he should have done from the beginning. Preston laughed harder than he had in years. Willa squeezed his hand under the table. That winter they worked the valley together, which was not always easy, because two people who are both intensely capable and independently minded do not always agree on method. There were arguments, the real kind, not the brittle kind, arguments that resolved because both of them understood that being right was less important than being honest, and that being honest sometimes meant admitting you were wrong. They had a particular disagreement about the placement of the main barn that went on for 3 days, and was ultimately settled by Willa drawing 3 diagrams and walking Preston through each one, until he could see that she was correct, which he acknowledged without resentment, because he was not a man who confused his ego with his intelligence. In the spring of 1884, Willa discovered she was pregnant. She told him on a morning in April, sitting at the kitchen table of the house that was now truly a house, finished and solid and hers, with the smell of coffee and wood smoke and the sound of the creek through the open window. She told him matter-of-factly, the way she told him everything, and he sat down in the chair across from her and looked at her for a long moment, and then he put his head in his hands and made a sound that was not quite laughing and not quite crying but somewhere in the country between them. "Preston," she said. "I am fine," he said. "I am completely fine, I just need a moment." "Take your time," she said, and poured him more coffee. Their son was born in December of 1884. They named him George, after a surveyor from New Mexico Territory, who had died on a road in Arizona, and left, in the careful accounting of the universe, something considerably more valuable than the land claim he had spent his last breath arranging. The boy came into the world with Willa's directness, immediately apparent in the set of his jaw and Preston's stubbornness apparent in basically everything else, and the midwife from the nearby town declared him the loudest baby she had delivered in 20 years, which both parents took as a compliment. Preston sat beside the bed in the hours after, with Willa sleeping and the baby sleeping and the valley going quietly about its December business outside, and he took out the journal, which he still carried even though the purpose of it had changed entirely. He did not write her name. He opened it to the first page, where he had written Willa Zane for the first time on the night George Zane died, in a small notebook on the side of a desert road, because a dying man had asked him to hold the name carefully. He wrote beside it in the margin where there was still space, "I found her. She is everything. George, we are both in good hands." He closed the journal and watched his wife and his son sleep in the lamplight, and outside the creek ran over its stones, cold and clear, the way it had been running since before anyone had a name for any of this. Life in the valley settled into a rhythm over the next years, not the uniform kind of rhythm that irons out all the texture, but the richer kind that keeps its surprises within a structure you trust. Preston worked the cattle and the horses and rode to Red Mesa every 6 weeks or so to see to the business interests he still maintained there. And the Ford brothers sent regular letters that were mostly about cattle tallies, but sometimes included observations about the weather or the local political situation, or Victor's ongoing, gentle feud with the Red Mesa banker Holt, which had become something of a community institution. Willer ran the valley operation with the combination of surveyor's precision and genuine physical competence that had been evident from the first time Preston watched her walk the land. She hired 2 workers, a man named Daniel and his wife Rosaria, who came from a small settlement 20 miles south, and who brought with them a knowledge of the land that supplemented and sometimes surpassed Willa's own considerable understanding. Willa paid them a fair wage without being asked to, and provided them with a solid separate dwelling, because she had opinions about how people were treated that were firm and non-negotiable, and Preston had no desire to negotiate them. He had also come to understand in their years together something about the particular injustice of the territory that Willa had been thinking about since long before he had. The way land was taken from people who had known it for generations. The way women had to fight for legal standing on the very land they worked. The way anyone outside a particular narrow category of person found the law applied to them at inconvenient angles. Willa talked about these things plainly, as facts rather than grievances, and Preston listened and arrived over time at a clearer view of the world he had been moving through than he had held before. Little George at 2 years old was a terror of the best kind, the kind that goes fearlessly at everything and survives primarily through physical resilience and the watchful attention of people who love them. He learned to walk across an uneven ground with the surety of someone who has never been told that falling is something to be afraid of. He followed Daniel around the property with absolute dedication, speaking in an increasingly complex mixture of English and Spanish that Rosaria was largely responsible for, and that Willa encouraged with the logic that a person who could move between 2 languages had twice the world to work with. Willa became pregnant again in the summer of 1887. This time she told Preston while they were riding along the east ridge of the valley, surveying a fence line that needed attention. She said it in the same matter-of-fact way she said things, and this time he did not put his head in his hands. This time he pulled up alongside her on Anchor, who was 9 years old now and deeply dignified, and he reached across and took her hand, and she rode with him like that for a while, side by side. The valley spread out below them in the late afternoon light, green and good, everything George Zane had meant for it to be. "I want a girl this time," she said, not particularly sentimentally. "George will be impossible with a younger sister," he said. "Good," she said. "I want him to have to learn patience with someone who will not cooperate with him. It will be excellent for his character." The second child was a boy. They named him Henry, and he was his brother's absolute opposite in temperament, a quiet, careful child who watched everything with large brown eyes and seemed to be processing information at a rate that slightly alarmed the adults around him. George loved him with the absolute proprietary love of a firstborn child for a sibling, which manifested mostly as constant supervision and periodic attempts to give Henry things that Henry did not yet want or need. Preston watched his sons in the years of their growing, and he thought about what he wanted for them. And what he wanted was the same thing George Zane had wanted for Willa: that they should know their own value, that they should have the practical tools to meet the world on honest terms, that they should know how to look at land and know what they were looking at, and that they should never mistake someone's name for a person without doing the work to understand the actual person behind it. He told George, who was 6 and deeply interested in Preston's journal, about the 2 years. He did not tell it as a confession or an embarrassment. He told it as a story, the way good stories should be told, which is as truthfully as possible and without omitting the parts where you behaved foolishly, because that is where the story gets interesting. George listened with the complete attention of a child who has not yet learned to pretend not to care about things, and at the end he said, "You wrote Mama's name every day for 2 years, and you had never even met her." "Yes," Preston said. George thought about this with his father's focus and his mother's precision. "That is very strange," he said. "It is," Preston agreed. "But it worked out," George said, with the practical satisfaction of a child who prefers resolutions. "It worked out," Preston said. George considered further. "Could I see the journal?" Preston handed it over. George turned the early pages with a care that surprised Preston, looking at the columns of his mother's name written over and over in his father's handwriting, the small notes beside them, the questions, the prayers, the one entry in the winter of 1881 that said simply, "I think she must be brave." "She is brave," George said with the absolute certainty of someone who has watched Willa Zane work deal with a lame horse, a flooded creek, a difficult negotiation with a neighboring landowner, and a rattlesnake in the kitchen garden all in the same week. "She is," Preston said. "She was always brave. I just did not know it yet." Willa came in from outside while they were sitting with the journal, her coat dusty from the afternoon's work, and she looked at the two of them with the expression she had when she was trying to decide whether to be amused or concerned, and had not yet landed on either. "What are you two doing?" She said. "Papa is showing me the journal," George said, "the one with your name in it." Willa looked at Preston with a look he had known for 6 years now, a look that held several things at once: the history between them, the particular exasperation of a practical woman for a man who has kept a habit that is both strange and deeply endearing, and something else underneath both of those things, warm and specific and entirely hers. "He showed you that," she said to George. "He said it was a story worth knowing," George said. Willa looked at Preston again. "Did he?" "He told it very well," George offered helpfully. Willa sat down at the table with them. She took the journal from George and turned a few pages herself, looking at her name in that cramped, deliberate handwriting, repeated across all those pages by a man who had been trying to hold onto something he owed, and had ended up holding on to something else entirely. "Your father," she said to George, "is a better man than he gives himself credit for, and also occasionally a complete mystery to me, even after all this time." "Is that good?" George asked. "It is the best possible thing," she said, and handed the journal back to Preston. He caught her hand before she could withdraw it, and she let him hold it there for a moment, at the kitchen table of the house in the valley that her father had meant for her, with their sons and the sound of the creek and the evening coming on outside. "I have been thinking," he said. "You are always thinking," she said. "Say what you are thinking." "I want to extend the house," he said. "There is the east wall that has always had room for another 2 rooms. Henry is going to need his own space before long, and I have been considering whether your father's survey equipment, what I managed to recover through Davis's office years ago, whether that ought to have a proper room rather than sitting in that chest under the bed where it currently lies." She looked at him. "You want to give my father's survey equipment its own room?" "I want to give you a room," he said, "where you can work, where you can have your maps and your diagrams and your books, a room that is yours for whatever you want to do with it." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "That is a good idea." "It is," he agreed. "I have them occasionally." "More than occasionally," she said. "You are generous," he said. George had been watching them with the analytical interest of a child learning, without knowing he is learning, how two people who love each other talk to each other in the ordinary language of a regular evening. "Will you write in the journal still?" George asked his father. Preston considered. He still did write in it, but differently now, not her name alone. Life. The ranch, the valley, the cattle counts and fence repairs, and the first words Henry said. And the afternoon George brought in a stone from the creek that turned out to be a small, perfect piece of amethyst, and presented it to his mother with the solemnity of someone bestowing a great honor. The letters from the Ford brothers, the slow, stubborn working of the land into something worth handing on, the events of the territory, the changing politics, the roads being built, the railroad coming closer every year to country it had not yet reached. "I will keep writing in it," Preston said. "But your mother's name is not the only thing in it anymore. There is considerably more." George looked satisfied with this. Henry, who had been sitting in the corner constructing something complicated with blocks and listening to everything with his customary quiet attention, said without looking up, "I want to see it too." "When you are older," Willa said. Henry accepted this with the equanimity he brought to most things. "All right," he said, and went back to his construction. Preston looked across the table at Willa in the lamplight of their kitchen, in their house, in their valley, and he thought about the road to Tucson in the autumn of 1880, and a man who had said a name with his last breath, and the way a single moment, given enough time and enough honesty and enough willingness to stay in the hard middle of something without flinching, could open out into all of this. He reached across the table and pushed a strand of hair back from her face, the casual, domestic intimacy of people who know each other through and through, and she leaned into the gesture slightly, not looking up from the map she had been studying before George distracted them, a map of the valley's water table that she had been annotating for 3 weeks. "Willa," he said. "Preston," she said, still looking at the map. "I love you," he said. She looked up. "I know," she said. "I have known since before you said it, since the valley in May, 2 years before we married." She paused. "I loved you too, I was just being careful." "You have always been careful," he said. "It has been, almost universally, a good thing." "Almost," she said. "Almost," he agreed. "There are moments when I would have preferred you had been a little less careful and a little sooner." She smiled the real smile, the one he had been watching accumulate its weight of meaning for years. "The writing of my name every day for 2 years in a journal rather than simply mailing a letter," she said, "is not a position from which I would recommend criticizing my pace." He laughed. George laughed too, though he did not entirely know why. Even Henry looked up from his blocks with something that might have been amusement. Outside the window, the valley was quiet in the way the valley got in the evening, when the light went from gold to the particular gray-blue that the red rock walls softened into at dusk. The creek was audible, steady and unhurried, the way it had been running before any of this began and the way it would run after, because water that finds its right course does not stop for human drama, it simply keeps moving, carving its way through what is hard, finding the level, going on. Preston Rourke had come to Arizona Territory at 26 with a small herd of cattle, and a profound reluctance to examine what he wanted from a life that kept asking him to want something from it. He had built a ranch on dry land, and kept his head down, and told himself that practical competence was its own sufficient reward. And then a man had died on a road and said a name, and the name had gotten into him like water gets into rock, slowly and with great patience, not destroying anything but changing the shape of things from the inside, until what had been solid and resistant became something more interesting, something that held light in its crevices and gave the patient plant a foothold. Willa Zane had come to her father's valley in the spring of 1883 with a survey's precision and a survivor's caution, and a life that she had built from scratch because the alternatives were not acceptable to her. She had not needed saving. She had needed only what she had eventually taken for herself, the land that was hers, the work she was suited for, the man who saw her clearly and was not diminished by what he saw. The journal sat on the shelf now with the other books, beside Willa's surveying manuals, and the almanac, and the 2 volumes of natural history George was currently obsessed with, and the small Spanish grammar that had appeared when Risaria's language started influencing the household vocabulary in ways that required official acknowledgement. The journal's spine was worn from handling. The leather cover had the soft, slightly concave look of something held often and with care. In the morning, Preston would ride out to check the east fence. Willa would work on the water table map. George would follow Daniel around the property and bring home another improbable stone. Henry would watch everything and speak at exactly the moment when speech was most useful and least expected. The creek would run over its stones with the particular sound that had become the sound of home, constant and specific, and absolutely itself. And the valley would hold all of it, the way good land holds what is planted in it, the way a careful man holds a name given to him in trust, the way a woman who has survived difficulty holds the knowledge of her own endurance, not as a burden but as a foundation, not as an ending, as the only kind of beginning that is built to last.